Good evening, everybody. I call to order the Bethany City Council special call meeting for Tuesday, February 4th, 2020 at 6 p.m. Item 1 is the discussion regarding the budget for the City of Bethany and the Bethany Public Works Authority, as well as other funds of the city and its public trust, including but not limited to revenues, expenditures, operational costs, sales tax revenues, debts and required debt service, capital and infrastructure needs and cost transfers between funds and the limited revenue sources. And with that, I will turn it over to our city manager, Brad Brown, for this presentation.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor and Council, thank you for allowing me this time to present this. And we're obviously in a new place tonight. We worked through some technical things, and I think we're actually on Facebook Live. There were some questions about whether we're going to be able to broadcast this first meeting. I believe that's being done, and hopefully that will go smooth as we work through some of the technical issues. So what I want to talk about tonight is something that we discovered in December. I arrived here as your city manager in October, and in early December we discovered some budget problems. And I want to talk about that tonight. And I kind of want to talk about a couple of things. I want to talk about kind of the elephant in the room with everybody about how we got here. That's real important to know that. We've had some discussion about budgets and from Frank Crawford, who's kind of an expert in the field of this, and he gave us a really good presentation. But I want to go into more details and kind of discuss how we got here a little bit, and then I also want to discuss what we've done and where we're headed. So, and I'm going to do that and kind of work through a presentation. And then at the end, I just want to have I know you'll have some questions for me because I'll leave things out. And I want you to ask those questions, and it's a time for a council to have discussions about these things. So, as we start out, there's many questions. I get these questions from citizens, my employees. I get this from council. When we talk about a budget deficit, everybody wants to know, where did the money go? So we're going to try to answer some of these questions tonight. And what do you mean when you say a $4.5 million deficit? Where are the contingencies and reserves? Who spent it? That's a big question, right? So we get that. How did this happen? What is being done and what needs to be done? So we're going to talk about all those things. The city has basically 17 different funds they operate off of. As the council is aware, we operate mainly out of two funds, primarily as our operating funds, and that's the general fund and the Public Works Authority fund. The other smaller funds are not going to be our focus tonight. They're important, but we generally operate out of these other two funds. So we're going to talk about those tonight in detail. And we're also going to be looking at the actual numbers we have versus budgeted numbers, and that's real important that we know the difference between those. When we deal with actual numbers, we're looking back at audits and we know exactly what was spent and what was taken in. When we talk about budgeted numbers, those are our predictions. Those are our guesses. And we are getting to the point where we can have the actual numbers. When I arrived here, our financial situation, we were behind in our record keeping, and we're working to try to catch that up so that we have more dependable numbers so that we're not flying in the fog on making decisions. So it's real important that we start, and we'll talk about the general fund. And on this particular slide, let me explain this to you when we look at this. This is looking at the actual expenses for basically the last 10 years since 2010, all the way up to our finances now in the general fund. And we'll look at the Public Works Authority fund in just a second, and then we'll combine them and look at them together because that gives us a better picture. So as you're looking back over time, you can see what's real important, that in our general fund, our revenues, they kind of went up, they kind of went stagnant a little bit, and then we've had a drop in our projected revenues, and there's some reasons for that. and we're gonna discuss that in some future slides here. But also what is really important that we notice is in that very right-hand column when we talk about expenditures, our expenditures have increased greatly. And all these slides, you're going to see that I've drawn a line between fiscal year 16 and fiscal year 17. And what I would tell you in my review of everything, it appears that we went off the rails in fiscal year 17. That's when we started a decline in our budgets. And we're going to talk about the reasons of why we think that happened. So again, real important, especially looking at our budgeted numbers towards the bottom in fiscal year 19 and 20. There's a big difference. There's not such a big difference at the top, right? Our revenue and expenditures are pretty close. We're able to get some money from the Public Works Authority Fund transferred over. But when you get towards the bottom, there's quite a separation. Now let's look at the Public Works Authority Fund. Kind of the same thing. As far as how it's laid out. If we look at the top, in fiscal year 10, we're making quite a bit more than we're spending out. So what we were able to do is take some of that revenue and transfer that over to the general fund on a regular basis. Now, as you go down and you start to look at numbers and you get to the very bottom, it's kind of basically a wash. You know, we're making about what we're spending to keep. And when we talk about the Public Works Authority Fund, that is how we operate our water system, our sewer system, our trash services, and whatnot. So as you start to get down in there, it kind of starts to become a wash. Now let's look at those together, because this is kind of it provides a picture, and kind of the same thing. And we look over here in the right-hand column, the net result. We're doing pretty good up through fiscal year 16. You know, we have a positive flow. We have money, excess money coming in that we're able to put into reserve funds. And then it starts to, there's some spending and some revenue stuff that starts in fiscal year 17 that we're going to talk about in a minute. And then we get down to fiscal year 20, our budgeted numbers. Now these are budgeted numbers, and again, what I would tell you in budgets, we always hope to spend less than we predict, and we want to make more than what we predict also. That's our goal. We want to be conservative in budgets, but we want to come out a little bit better off in budgets and get our actual numbers. So as we look at that, you know, you get towards the bottom, we're spending a lot more than we're making. So the question is, why did this happen? And there's a lot of reasons, I think, of why this happened. I think everybody's aware there was a lot of chaos in the city over the last several years as far as the turnover of city managers, finance directors over a 3 to 4 year period. Our financials, the city council, I don't believe was getting really good financial reports. I think those were I think the financials were behind. The finance reports were behind, especially I know that looking back over the last year and a half, you weren't getting good information. We had some incorrect numbers in our fund balances for the general fund. We started off with less money than we actually thought we had at the beginning of this fiscal year because of some mistakes that were made over the past couple of years, so you weren't getting good numbers. We've had a significant increase in personnel costs over the last several years, and we'll talk more about that in a specific slide so you can understand that. Our general expenses, and we know our expenses are going to increase. Nothing gets cheaper, so we've had that. You know, then we have to talk about sales tax. Bethany was founded as a bedroom community, which means there really wasn't a lot of commercial things that went on in Bethany. It wasn't intended for that when it was founded. So we've suffered from sales tax growth and a stagnant sales tax over years. So that's important to understand. There's been a lack of economic growth in the city, and we can see that from our revenues and the reports we just looked at on the previous slides. We've had a significant decrease, and there's different explanations for this in our fine and court revenues. We've gone from about 1.3 million to 700,000 in the last 4 years. So that's part of that $4.5 million spread. And we've also had decreased water sales. We have had water issues. We haven't been able to produce the amount of water to sell it, so we've had those issues. And then also, we have, as a city, failed to raise utility rates, and that's important. Our sanitation rates have not increased since 2012. And, in my opinion, we're doing our city a disservice by not keeping those utility rates up, because we've been spending money, but we haven't been doing the things to increase those rates to be able to keep up revenues. So while it's been great, and we are really in the metro area one of the cheapest cities as far as utility rates, we are, because we're studying that, but that's kind of a disservice to our city, and it's put us in a bind over the years. So that's real important to know. I told you I wanted to talk about increased personnel costs for a minute. Increased personnel costs are actually a story that's being done in the Bethany Tribune now. I think they did a story last week, and they're going to do another story this next week. So I want to talk about that in particular. And I'm looking at overall personnel costs over the last, we're looking at it over the last 7 years, but in particular, I want you to pay attention to the last 4 years. And there's, out of our $4.5 million gap, almost 40% of that increase, that spread that we've had, that problem that we have in our budget, that $4.5 million, almost 40% of that is attributed to raises and salaries. Now, there may be some good reasons for that, studies and whatnot. We want to definitely keep up with salaries in the metro area, and because we want to be able to attract workers that will come here and work. So we want to be competitive. But we also have to budget our personnel costs and increases on the money we have. We can't spend money we don't have. So we've been doing that over the last 4 years. We've been spending money that have been coming out of our reserves. Basically, we've been transferring savings over, and we've been using that savings. And so we've been giving raises. We've given $1,800,000 in overall raises during that period. That's where we're at now. Each year in our budget, as of now, we've increased that. The police and fire have benefited greatly from that as far as overall rate increases or pay increases. So that kind of gives you a percentage. So we're paying a lot more in personnel costs. So that's important to understand. So the results of what have happened is we have, as you look back at those sheets, we have about a $4.5 to a $4.8 million gap in our budget in revenue versus expenses. We spent a lot of our cash reserves, most of our cash reserves over the last 4 years. We have cash flow issues right now, which means we've done some things to mitigate that. We're in emergency spending mode and some other things. We'll discuss that in a minute. But we are very cognizant of our cash flow and trying to project that out. Again, we had general fund starting balances that were incorrect at the beginning of this year, so that has led to why we have cash flow issues. And our gap, when we talk about this gap of $4.5 million in our budget, that doesn't include contingency funds. And the recommended contingency fund is a minimum of 10% of our budget, which is going to be about $1.5 million. So really, you've got about a $6 million spread in there from where we need to budget to where we are budgeting. So important to understand that. What has been done so far? I've implemented emergency spending, which is where we only spend if the safety and health of the city has a need for that, and we started that I think about December 10th. We've been able to greatly reduce and control that spending. We've issued a citywide hiring freeze. We've moved to overtime that is emergency and reimbursed from various programs only. We've hired an outside accountant to look at our finances and assist us in getting those records caught up. The City Council also called for a state audit, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes, the status of that. We've got a new finance director who's doing a great job in providing us some information that you're going to start seeing the benefits of here really quick in the form of various reports. Again, we're bringing our financials current. They were not current when I got here. Reconciliations were far behind, so it was like we were flying in the fog a little bit. So we're getting those caught up. We're doing an ongoing utility rate study. The results of some of that are going to be presented to you in probably the next meeting. And we're also doing an in-depth study of our revenues and expenses. So those are some of the things that have been done since we've discovered this budget issue. What needs to be done? How do we get through this? You know, I'm from the city. We all have a vested interest in this city. This is my hometown. And so it's not good enough to say where we're at. Everybody wants to know what caused this. And that's what those previous slides I hope answer some of those questions. But the real issue is, how do we move forward, right? How do we get past this? How do we not lose our city to these problems that we're having? This is a big problem. This is a tremendous problem. And it's an easy solution, but it's painful. It's going to be a painful solution. Let's be very clear about that. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to decrease expenses. I think everybody would agree with that. We tighten our belt as much as we can. I've asked all my department heads to look at what a 20% cut would look like across their departments. I've received reports back from those department heads. To be honest with you, I don't think a 20% cut will work to keep the city operational. I think it's more down along the lines of maybe a 13% cut, but we can talk about details of that in some upcoming sessions. Those are really, really painful cuts, and we're still studying that. We're looking at other efficiencies, and I'll talk more about that in an upcoming slide. And then when we cut those expenses, we've got to catch up our revenues, because we haven't done that. We simply have not done that. We haven't raised rates. We're one of the cheapest cities in the metropolitan area for utilities. So we have to do a couple things. We have to increase our short and long-term income. And the problem is this problem is staring us right in the face, and we don't have a lot of time to react to this budget issue because we have cash flow issues. So we have to look in the very short term, we have to look at efficiencies, and we also have to look at a utility rate increase. And when I say that, we're going to look at some numbers on the utility rate increase, and it's real important to remember that there's a couple of ways to increase that. One is the base rate, and one are the tables. So we might charge more for people that use more, and we might charge less on raising our base rate. So we've got some options there we have to work through. And then we also, after we come through this and moving forward, we also have to look at long-term. We have to look at our sales tax revenues and our economic development. We have to try to increase that. I'm going to take a drink for just a second. Mouth's getting a little dry. So we have to look at that. We have to look at both short and long-term and mid-range solutions, and we're doing that as we talk. And we also have to have really strong financial management moving forward. And, you know, part of that is consisting of very good, concise reports for this council and for management of the city. And I think we've got a good team in place moving forward to have that strong financial management. When we talked about efficiencies just a second ago, there's many, many efficiencies under consideration. And part of what makes my job hard is it's really when you're looking at this and you're in the midst of it, there's a lot of rumors that go around about things that we're going to do. And I can tell you we're being very methodical about the things we're looking at. And we're taking our time to make those decisions. But there's a lot of rumors, and I think the employees and the citizens all need to understand that we're still developing that total plan, and we're gonna do that methodically and fairly and with a lot of consideration, but we also have to do it in a very short time period because we've got a problem we have to solve pretty quick. So over the month of February and March, we're going to be solving that solution, and we're going to be bringing some of those things to council. We're looking at the consolidation of some departments and services, some advertising that we did in community development outreach. We're looking at that. We have to consider the special events and the Freedom Festival, and those are some discussions that the City Council is going to have about that. We put utility bill inserts in our utility bills. That cost us about $800 a month to send those out. So we're looking at that. We're looking at overtime, step raise suspension. We're under an emergency spending, so we're going to ask the council to look at that for non-union employees. In the council meeting tonight. So, and there's literally about 100 efficiencies that we're looking at. This is only a short number of them, but to give you some idea. But a lot of these aren't settled. So let's talk a few minutes about department cuts and utility rate increases, because those are really directly proportional to each other. The amount that the council decides to raise the utility rates directly affects the amount of cuts that the management of the city will have to make. And so we really have to look at what is reasonable. I talked to you a little bit about the lack of our rate increase, and also that we're one of the lowest cities for utilities in the metro area. That's important to understand. There is definitely room for our rate increases. We've enjoyed being one of the cheapest cities, but I believe we've done our city a disservice because it's helped us to get into this situation. And again, I talked to you a little bit about base rates versus the tables, a couple of different ways to raise those rates. And the tables that I have down below here are estimates of what our shortfall would possibly cost us in a rate increase. And so we've looked at a range of those rates as compared, because it's kind of, I think you can think of this as two sliders. When one goes up, the other one goes down. And so one side of this table, each one of these tables, one side represents the cuts that you would make to the city in a percentage, and the amount is on the very left side, and the right two columns represent what that would cost an average across all rate holders in the city of Bethany. And we have 7,100 utility accounts in this city. And so when you calculate that, it's a real easy calculation to see what it would cost. Now, I will tell you, looking at some very preliminary information, that we're behind about it appears about $12 to $15 in our overall in a metro average. Now, Steve Caton is doing a pretty in-depth utility study, so he's going to hopefully not make a liar out of me, but he's going to give you some better numbers to look at in the coming weeks on what those utility rates look like. And so those two different tables represent what it would take to make up our $4.5 million shortfall, and what it would take to make up the shortfall plus the contingency. I hope that makes sense. You know, one of them's $4.5 million on that table, the other's $6 million. And so if you look at the $4.5 million and you go down to a 13 or 15% rate cut, that's a pretty significant rate increase that we're looking at on an average. Now, I would tell you that doesn't mean that everybody's rate is going to raise that. It may be that a base rate raises up a certain amount, and people who use more water and trash service may make up some of that difference and may actually pay a little bit more. So those are something that we're going to be bringing that rate study to the council, but it's pretty significant, the difference that we have. So let's talk about immediate plans, what we plan on doing over the month of February and March. Again, we're working with an accounting firm, Crawford & Associates. They have one of the best reputations in Oklahoma for municipal accounting, and so they're assisting us to catch up our financials. We've also had several conversations. I want to talk about the state audit that you requested for just a second. The state auditor, and Claudia can also speak to this if you have some questions, because she had some direct conversations with them also. They are, like everybody I think in the state, have a limited amount of resources. And they have told us to begin this audit, it would be a minimum of 4 months to do that. And if a priority came up, it may actually be longer than that. And they've made a suggestion to us, and they've worked closely with Crawford before, that Crawford actually perform a transitional audit because they believe they can answer the questions that the council has. And this presentation may answer some of your questions that for the reason you had a state audit, but it's always important to have an outside source look at this. So a suggestion that we're going to make is to consider council to consider having Crawford perform that particular audit, and we will be able to get that done and get that started a lot sooner. And again, here in a minute, I'll be happy to entertain any questions you might have on that. We're also going to come back and we're going to propose a pretty immediate utility rate, at least the base rate increase. War Acres had a problem. Let's put this kind of into perspective. They had a $350,000 shortfall in their budget, and they solved that by a $7 rate increase. We have a very much more significant problem than they have. Now, they have half the population that we have, I think. Is that roughly? So we're going to propose a pretty immediate utility base rate increase. And we're going to continue the utility study during this month and try to determine the utility table changes that we need to make. And we're also deep into starting to prepare for those budgets, for that budget for next year. But we're also going to have to come back because we're set to end our general fund in a deficit, and we can't do that by law. So we're going to have to come back probably and amend. We will have to come back and amend our fiscal year 20 budget. So those are things we're going to be working on over the next couple of months. It's real important to remember this is a work in progress. We are still defining the details of all this. This is a big problem with some hard solutions, and it's going to take a little time to work through some of this. But again, we are working diligently and methodically to get to this and get towards a solution. And that is my presentation. I'd be happy to entertain any questions you have for me, or if you want to have discussion among yourselves, I would just open that floor for that.
Does anyone on council have any questions?
I do, Mayor.
Yes.
Do we not have for 2019 the actual revenues and expenditures yet?
You do not. That financial audit has not been completed because your financials are behind. We have set a target date of February 20th to have all of that caught up. As soon as that's caught up, the financial audit will be completed.
Do we have numbers that are unaudited?
You mean actuals?
Yeah.
We do. So let me talk about that for just a second, because that's a real good point. So we are running numbers now. How reliable those are still, we don't feel that they're 100% reliable. But we are coming in. There is some good news. Our revenues are up. Our projected revenues in our budget. In our budget, we projected revenues at about 15.1 million, and now we're projecting those to come in at the end of the year about 15.7. We're early in this year to be making those predictions, but that's kind of what we're predicting. We're also predicting that those expenses are going to come in under budget because we put emergency cost controls in place. So we have spent over what we've made so far. I'd have to look at the exact numbers, but we've brought in about 8 million, and we spent about 8.5, I believe, are the numbers, something close to that. Look at Mr. Vaughn, he's shaking his head that's probably correct. But again, those are numbers from December 31st, so that's 6 months into the year. So, and that's another good point that we need to talk about. The council passed an ordinance last year, and I understand the ordinance, that you want a budget by March, the first week in March. Now, it's also important to understand that's going to be a very preliminary budget, because we're going to be relying on numbers on revenues and expenses from about the January time period. So I can tell you that budget's going to change between March and June when it's formally adopted, because you're not going to have reliable numbers from the previous year at that point. But it is important that you start to see those budgets at an early time, and I do understand that, and I agree with that.
And when we voted for that, it was simply to get started with the process and the discussion, because we were always getting it at the last second.
I understand. So. I think that's a good move.
Anybody else have any questions?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
just in looking in personnel costs, and obviously we only have back to 14, so not able to see total long range, but it seems to be quite a drastic jump between 17 and 20 across the board, and not doing the percentage yet in my head for total personnel, but especially for police and fire. Is there some outlier? Was there something special during those times that caused, at least according to this small segment, a substantial jump?
I think the unions did a good job in negotiating. No, I don't have a good explanation for you on that. I will tell you that, the unions look and they present, and the city looks back. They look at metro averages in their study of costs or of salaries. And so what that means is, and one of them here could probably tell me the cities, I can't name them offhand, but I think there's about 7 cities or so that we look at. And that includes Oklahoma City, and it also includes some smaller cities. So when we negotiate with them, and they've negotiated in the past, I haven't been a part of those past negotiations, but that's something that they look at as part of their contract, are the metro averages. And I think that's good. You want to keep up with that because you want to attract people, but you also have to have the budget for that.
Right. Yeah, if we go up another $1 million in 3 years, then we need a whole new formula.
We're in trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said that, as we know, the city was founded as a bedroom community and has always struggled with sales tax. In the metro, all other cities, where do you think we fall in regards to generating sales tax?
Well, I think you can look back at the budgets. I don't have those numbers in front of me, but I think we've been pretty stagnant in that. We haven't had a lot of commercial growth in Bethany, and we are a landlocked city, so that's hard. There's several cities in Oklahoma that are like that are stagnant. Now, there's some promising things going on in Bethany that we're aware of. Some of those things we can and can't talk about because some of those things are underway. But there are some promising things that would bring some sales tax growth to the city. So, but that's more of a mid to long-term solution on that.
Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
So going back to looking at our personnel, can you just line out what departments have unionized employees and roughly how many non-union employees we have?
Sure. We have about, and the number varies a little bit, but I think we have 135, about maybe close to 140 positions in the city. Police and fire are our 2 unions. Nobody else operates under a union. Chiefs, what's your number? 21 and what? 28. 21 for fire and 28 for police.
And do we expect to be able to reduce some of those costs for personnel through attrition? What does that picture look like?
Yeah, I think we're still looking at that, and still, there's obviously, as part of those cuts, we're going to have to decrease positions, and that's the very first thing we look at is positions, not people. But it is probably going to affect some people also. And I don't want to send a shockwave or panic. And we're looking at those things very methodically, and we're looking at combining resources to try to preserve that. But we've got some pretty tremendous cuts to undertake.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
on your chart, department cuts versus utility rate increases, this $4.5 million shortfall, the estimated cost per resident would be approximately $30 to $33 a month. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
So if that $4.5 million, that would be what we would receive if we made those utility increases, correct? Does that include any type of personnel cuts, the 20% that you mentioned, or?
Well, the percentage of the cuts, it's represented in a chart so you can see the various cuts. The second column represents the percentage of the cut across departments
Okay.
as an estimate. The third column represents the dollar amount per month. I'm sorry, I didn't explain it well. And then the first column represents the amount that would be saved with the cuts. The fourth column represents the amount of revenue that would be increased. And that is a confusing table, and I'm sorry I didn't take a little more time.
Well, no, it's not confusing when you kind of give me some topic headings on the top. I think it's very
Yeah.
clear. So when you say 13%, that's the number that you referenced to a cut to get the $4.5 million shortfall taken care of, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Got another one, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, sir.
Have we made any headway in discovering how we were unaware that we were going to have the shortfall? I mean, obviously, if we are spending more than we have coming in, we're going to have a shortfall, but we weren't aware of it. Has anything developed on that?
Well, yeah, let's talk about that just a second. So let me go back to this slide a little bit. When we look at the net results of what have happened, and I've drawn that line between fiscal year 16. And I've got to hand it to, and I don't know him. I've met him once, but as I look back at John Shugart's budgets, they were pretty sound. And then there's a lot of chaos below that line. I was the 7th city manager in that time period. I was the third one you had hired permanently. You had hired 2 more, and they, one of them lasted a while, and one of them lasted about 4 months, and we won't go into those details, but then you had a lot of interim city managers in between there. And so I think as far as city managers, there's a lot of discussion that can be made, and then also you went through some different finance managers, and council changed, and so there was a tremendous amount of chaos during that time period. And you weren't getting, there's not good financial information. Your finances were behind. They weren't, in the end, they weren't reconciled correctly. So when I got here, I was flying in a cloud looking at your finances. I started to discover more and more that those finances were behind, and there were certain things that weren't in the computerized budget that were in the printed budget. Your budgets are, your budget is can be somewhat confusing, but really what that budget boils down to, that is published each year, is really about your revenues and expenditures and the difference that you had between them. And if you go over that, if you're spending more than you're making, you're going to be pulling out of your reserves or your savings account, what you could commonly call it, and that's what happened. And you, over the past 3.5 years, the city's blown through a lot of those reserves.
Anyone else?
Mayor? Your combined revenues from fiscal year 17 to fiscal year 20, we dropped almost $2.1 million.
It's from
Do you-
fiscal year what?
18 to fiscal year 20, our revenue is projected to be down almost $2.1 million. Do you have any more insight onto that? Why that projection is so low?
What's about,
I
did
mean,
you say
what-
from 18 to 19 or 20?
18 to 20.
There's a lot of reasons for why your income has decreased. There's a decrease in water sales. I'd really have to go back and
I mean, because that's
And-
huge, that's significant, and I'm in
Yeah.
the revenue summaries, and it just
No-
doesn't add up.
Now,
to
let
me
me be
short.
clear for just a second, and I talked about it for just a little bit, but let's be clear that those are actual numbers versus budgeted numbers. So when you look at fiscal year 20, what we projected we were going to make, we're making a lot more than that. Our revenues are up to in the mid-15s, or we're projecting revenue in the mid-15s at this point. So those bottom two rows that are blue, those are projections. And so that's, we don't have actuals on those yet. So your expenditures are also going to be down. So that is good news that we're delivering, that those, there are difference between what you thought it was going to be and what it looks like the actuals are going to be. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm just in the budget summary from 20, and I just don't see that significant difference. So that's why I was just trying to grasp a better
Okay.
understanding.
And I'd be happy to look at those numbers again and see if we can come up with why that might be seeing a difference.
Anyone else?
I don't
You,
know.
you know, I'll tell you real quick also that Crawford, when they did this study, the same study, they found about a $4.5 million difference. So that may explain some, because there's a lot of different documents that I'm looking at, and so we actually Crawford thought the budgeted amount was about 15.1, and they thought the difference was about 4.5. So I'd be happy to look back at that. Then that may make up some of the difference, depending on the document we're looking at.
Mrs. Larson, did you have a question?
Not so much a question, but an observation. And having a little bit of the county background for a good part of my life. Talking about your budget versus your actual, this makes sense. You really don't know. You're grasping for straws.
Right.
I can say that under the circumstances, I think we all want to grasp straws as well and place blame somewhere. I'm one to say if the ship crashes, whoever's in charge, and the council's been in charge, we can blame ourselves. Whether we were here or not, we have a responsibility to make it better. That's our responsibility as this council that's sitting here right now, regardless of who did it or why they did it. I am confident that since it was discovered in the first 2 or 3 months that Mr. Brown was here, I can say from the contact I've had with the city that they're doing their darndest. That's the nicest thing I can say, because I know that they're doing diligently daily to address this issue. There's no simple answer. You've made that clear. And for this amount of money and for this city to remain solvent in the future, we're going to have to bite the bullet, and we're going to have to tighten the belt, and we're not going to like it. I watched Mr. Schugert get our finances in a very A-rated financial position for over 10 years. And I don't want us to have to do this in 10 years to get back to that point, that we do our due diligence, that we suck it up, and we can do it in less time and be in a far better shape and learn from the mistakes and lay the groundwork for our future. And I really think we have to think in that mindset to move forward. I'm very appreciative of the staff that has worked on this, and I want to say thank you.
I agree. Is there anyone else? Any other questions?
Mayor? I think as a council, we need to also decide, and you're working towards this, I mean, what is our emergency fund going to be? And I hope instead of spread out in multiple contingency accounts, that we actually get to a fund that's labeled emergency fund
And not shuffled around.
and not shuffled around. Yeah.
Yep. I think that only makes sense, quite honestly. Is there anybody else? Anything you'd like to say in closing?
I can't think of anything else.
We'll get there. We will get there. I appreciate this work and this information. I appreciate Mr. Vaughn being on board and looking forward to getting accurate information that is easy for a guy like me to be able to make sense of when I'm looking at it. So I appreciate the work you guys are doing. And with that, if we have no more questions, this special meeting will be adjourned. Our council meeting begins at 7:30. And we are adjourned.